Welcome everyone to CG seminar webinar number 301. And today we're going to hear about a UNESCO project on flexible learning pathways. To help us with this, we have John Brennan and Michaela Martin. I'll introduce them in a moment, but first, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and the webinar recording will be accessible on our website within 24 hours or so, and that takes you into our YouTube channel, which has all our past webinars and our last two online conferences. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to keep yourself muted. Extraneous noise can interrupt things, and you don't need to have your camera on either during the presentation part of the webinar. We advise you to use speaker view there in the top right-hand corner so you can see who's speaking at any given time. Now, we want you to participate in our Q&A section, which is an important part of the webinar. And the way you participate in that is you post your question or your statement about the presentation in the chat box. And I'll select the participants in the Q&A part of the webinar from what's coming forward in the chat. So good idea if you want to speak in the Q&A to come in early into the chat, because if you bring your comment forward in the last 5 minutes or so, you're likely to run into the problem that the speaker list is full and you miss out. Now, when you're invited into the Q&A, and I'll give you a warning in the chat before that happens, you unmute yourself, most important, turn on your camera, and then you tell us who you are and where you are from, and then you ask your question or make your statement. Well, let me introduce our two presenters. John Brennan is an honorary research fellow at Oxford University and an emeritus professor at the UK Open University, a most distinguished career producing major reports on higher education in Europe and in the UK. He's a sociologist by background, but I think it's fair to say, John, you bring our kind of multidisciplinary sensibility to bear on your work on higher education, as many researchers do. Michaela Martin has also got a long and active record as a researcher come organisation person in higher education. She holds a doctorate in education from the University of Paris, postgraduate degree from the College of Europe in Belgium, and a master's degree in Franco-German economic relations from the University of Paris III. She's been at the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning since 1990. That's not bad. Nice continuity, where she's been specialising in the management of higher education. And I think her name is very well known in connection with numerous projects and reports. It's a pleasure to work with both John and Michaela today, and we look forward to their presentation. I guess I should hand to you first, John. The screen is yours.
Oh,
or is it Michaela?
I think it's first my turn.
Okay, you're first.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Simon, for this warm welcome to both of us. Let me share my screen. Is this good? So let me go
Looks
to
good.
the
Yeah.
slide mode. Okay.
Yeah.
Are we fine?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Excellent. I have to move some images on the screen. So again, Simon, thank you so much for this warm welcome to me, and also introducing our institute, the UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning. Okay, I see that I have to move my slides. I'm not starting from the beginning. So now we are there. So our institute, I should just mention, is an institute whose main mandate is capacity development in educational planning and management. Our institute has been working over the past 50 years on higher education governance and planning. And so 4 years ago, we ventured into this project on flexible learning pathways. And what we want to do today, John and myself, John will speak about the UK perspective of the project, and I will do the more general introduction and highlight some findings. We will then present the project in its totality. But let me first say some words about the rationale behind the research. I think it is very much based, I think, in the global expansion of higher education enrollments. In 2020, we have 235 million higher education students, and in 2000 we had only 100 million. So we have this huge expansion, and within this context, the higher education systems have become more diversified, with many types of higher education providers working frequently in parallel with each other. And therefore, students find it more difficult to navigate through increasingly fragmented higher education sectors. And in most countries, the student body has also become more diverse, with more first-generation students, adult learners, and higher education returnees. And this growing diversity of learners calls for higher education systems that are capable to adapt to their more diverse circumstances and that offer choice to students. And then in addition, within the context of the present sanitary crisis, the request for flexible learning has become much more prominent. Emerging evidence suggests that higher education institutions that have been offering flexible approaches in the delivery of education were better equipped to respond to the health crisis and to ensure learning continuity. Before I present the findings of our research, I would like to consider how we define flexible learning pathways in our research. So first, some words about flexible learning. Flexible learning is understood in the literature as the process of learning that is free from the constraints of time, place, and pace, where a learner can choose the entry and exit points, learning activities, assessment modes, and educational resources. And in our research, we also relied on the definition that is provided in the Education 2030 agenda, which is the agenda that relates to SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 4 of the United Nations Framework for Development, which defines flexible learning pathways as the entry points and re-entry points at all ages and all educational levels, strengthened links between formal and non-formal structures, and recognition, validation, and accreditation of the knowledge, skills, and competences acquired through non-formal and informal education. So it's about the recognition of learning taking place in different contexts, non-formal, informal, but also formal contexts, to allow the learner to move into different institutional settings. So in 2018, we launched the project SDG4, Planning for Flexible Learning Pathways in Higher Education. And the research has looked at the question of how national policies influence institutional practices to flexibilize higher education in terms of alternative admission, opportunities for credit accumulation to support student transfers, as well as in the delivery and pace of higher education programs. It also considered the role of governance that can either support but also inhibit flexible learning pathways. So the research is based on a three-stage methodology. First, we conducted a stocktaking exercise, clarified concepts and definitions of flexible learning pathways, and identified good practices internationally. Second, an international survey conducted among ministries of education in all UNESCO member states identified the full range of policy options available to support flexible learning pathways, as well as the factors that facilitate and impede the implementation of them. So, and then last but not least, 8 country case studies from Chile, Finland, India, Jamaica, Malaysia, Morocco, South Africa, and the United Kingdom and John is with us, provided in-depth analysis on how effectively flexible learning pathways were implemented at the national and institutional levels. And the case studies I should mention were produced in partnership with national organizations from these countries or researchers, such as in the case of the UK Professor John Brennan. So in our research, we focused on flexible learning pathways that lead to a qualification. So we were looking in particular at the following three pathways. Pathways for getting into higher education, to cover alternative admission policies and practices, for instance, recognition of prior learning and open access policies, pathways for getting through higher education, flexibility in pace, delivery and transfer opportunities, and pathways for transitioning to the labor market, such as work-based learning and flexible degree structures. So some words about flexible entry pathways. As I just mentioned, as part of our research, we carried out an international survey to understand the existing policies and practices that support flexible learning pathways. The international survey was sent out to all UNESCO member states, and we received some 76 exploitable country responses. We learned that in many countries, short cycle qualification programs, so ISCET 5, which is 2 years after the general secondary school leaving examination, for instance, offered at vocational colleges, allowed for more permeability and diverse entry pathways than academic level programs. By contrast, bachelor level programs, ISCET level 6 bachelor programs were less permeable, with the most common entry pathways being a general secondary school leaving certificate, a vocational secondary school certificate, and a general formal qualification from a post-secondary non-tertiary institution. One of the interesting findings also was that recognition of prior learning based on non-formal and informal learning were relatively less common. So we can see here on the dark blue lines the entry pathways into ISCET 5 level. So we can see that there are many more possibilities than in the second bar here, which shows the ISCET level 6 entry opportunities. So some words about what we found on recognition of prior learning from our case study research. So all of the 8 case countries had systems of recognition of prior learning. In our case study sample, several countries had strong national policies for the facilitation of RPL with responsibilities delegated to external accreditation or validation providers, such as in the UK and Malaysia. In others, responsibilities for the recognition of prior learning were mainly based at the institutional level, for instance, in South Africa and in Finland. In Malaysia, one of our case countries, a national system called Accreditation of Prior Experiential Learning, APLA, was created for access and credit transfer of learning gains in informal and non-formal settings. It is implemented through designated APL centers across the country that are authorized to conduct the recognition of prior learning application procedure and testing. While there are countries with very advanced uses of recognition of prior learning, generally, however, we observe that RPL is not a mainstream entry pathway into higher education in most countries. So in our case study sample, we noticed that the highest was actually a 5% share of the overall entries into higher education that were realized through recognition of prior learning procedures. Some words about open entry. So open entry has been identified as a popular route in many cases, in many of our case countries. The examples here are Finland, Chile, Malaysia, India, UK, and Morocco. And open entry is meant for continuous learning, reskilling and upskilling, but sometimes also to offer learning opportunities to students who could not access higher education, who didn't receive a study place. Open entry allows learners to take part in higher education without meeting traditional entry requirements. For instance, through their participation in selected university courses or MOOCs. So Finland has an interesting policy initiative, the so-called Open Study Route. Finnish universities provide access via open studies to those who could not get a study place after secondary schooling, and simultaneously to adult learners. Classes are open to anyone and they do not require entry examination. Open studies have the same content and requirements as traditional programs in public higher education institutions, but they do not lead to a qualification. However, a certain share of credits, which is decided independently by each higher education institution, can be recognized towards a degree when a student enrolls in a degree program at the same higher education institution where the open studies had been pursued. So some words about flexible progression pathways. Flexibility in the pace of study means that students can choose to a certain extent the duration of their studies leading to a qualification and thereby combine their studies and work. It is normally facilitated through part-time, evening, weekend, holiday season, or other types of provision as opposed to full-time, full daytime study. We have seen a good practice in the UK, where the accelerated degree exists, allowing learners to earn a bachelor degree in 2 years if they agree to supplement regular classes with weekend and holiday period learning. But more typically, what we can see are modalities where the regular study time of 3 or 4 years for a bachelor degree can be spread over a longer study period. And that is nearly the case in every country that allow this to a certain extent. Now, some words about flexibility in delivery. So open online and distance learning, which heavily relies on the use of the internet, digital platforms and other tools, was available to different extents in our case countries. It enables flexibility in terms of location of learning and pace of study. It therefore allows to expand access to education and enables continuous learning opportunities for reskilling or further studies for diverse types of students. India has developed an online massive open online course platform, which is called the Study Webs of Active Learning for Young Aspiring Minds, complicated name, SWAYAM. The platform aims to provide access to MOOCs and other e-learning content developed by various education providers. An important aspect of MOOCs hosted on the SWAYAM platform is their potential to receive recognition by higher education institutions. Under current provisions, a student entering a higher education study program in a university, in a face-to-face regular university, can transfer up to 20% of credits from relevant online courses completed on SWAYAM, something that one could imagine being a useful model for countries to follow under the current circumstances. So some final words about the governance, which we wanted to study as well to see how governance can support flexible learning pathways or not. And I think I just want to say some words here. There's much more, of course, that we have seen in our research, but the time doesn't really allow to go too much into depth. But some words about funding. Of course, funding is tremendously important. And what we have seen in some of our case countries are special government funding mechanisms, such as project funding. We have seen it, for instance, in Finland, where project funding supports the creation, the constitution of university consortia to allow cross studies. So a student can, in one of the universities from the consortia, can take courses in the other universities of the consortium. They are recognized towards the qualification of the student. So this is one thing. Project funding is one thing, but the other thing is also funding for credits, which I think is a very important element. So we have seen also that Finnish universities, they provide funding to the Finnish higher education provides funding to the universities for credits And funding is not based on the number of students that a university welcomes. So this, of course, provides a good incentive for universities also to allow students to take part only in some credits rather than a full study program. Some more words about quality assurance in support of flexible learning pathways. So quality assurance can either support or it can also inhibit flexible learning pathways. And the quality assurance is really based on a rather traditional academic model. We have seen that, for instance, in Chile, where innovations like ODL, open and distance learning, or flexible recognition of credits gained in other higher education institutions were not the favored, were not part of the model and part of the criteria that was foreseen in the quality assurance model. But quality assurance can also facilitate flexible learning pathways through an alignment between program standards and the national qualification framework and program and level descriptors, and therefore facilitate both horizontal and vertical student transfers. Quality assurance can support the implementation of recognition of prior learning, credit transfer systems, flexible mode of delivery, and proposed guidelines for the improvement. So we have seen that several quality assurance agencies of the case countries were actually preparing guidelines for the implementation of ODL or the implementation of MOOCs, and therefore facilitated quality standards and in turn their recognition. So a good example here comes from India, where the National Assessment and Accreditation Council is monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the choice-based credit system, as well as the delivery of MOOCs. And so as in India, accreditation has become mandatory for all universities. This also provides an incentive actually for the universities to implement these opportunities for flexible pathways in their systems. So I want to stop here, and now I pass it to John to draw on the UK experience.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to draw on some of the issues that came out of the UK case study. But I mean, for those of you who are not fully aware of the higher education system in the UK, I'll just start with a few overview points. In fact, one of the starting points I would make was I remember interviewing somebody for one of our national higher education bodies. I can't remember now exactly which one it was, but when I mentioned about, you know, the UK higher education system, they answered, well, actually, we don't have a UK higher education system. In part, you could say that we've got 4, one each for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. On the other hand, we could also say that we don't have any higher education systems because individual higher education institutions are given a lot of autonomy over what they actually do. So diversity, institutional autonomy, linked to that quite a competitive market where, in a sense, institutions are more focused on competing with other institutions than collaborating with them. At the national policy level, I've indicated that in many respects, it focuses on what institutions are allowed to do rather than what they are required to do. A massified system, around about 50% of the population now goes into higher education, and they pay for it. We have a national system of loans now, but in fact, we've got a system where the customers are the students, and linked to that, quite a kind of consumerist marketized system. As Michaela already mentioned, growth of blended learning, online and face-to-face, has developed considerably as a result of the pandemic, and does seem to be likely to stay in the longer term. I'll just add briefly about the case study that I did in the UK, because in a sense, because we have such a diverse system, and we don't necessarily can generalize from the case study institutions. I collected data from national policy bodies for universities, which were Birmingham, Exeter, Teesside, and the Open University. I would like to just mention briefly an organization called Future Learn, which was also contributed to the project, because this was an organization established by the Open University some years ago, but is now a network of well over 100 universities and other organizations internationally. There are 30 universities or more which are part of Future Learn in the UK. Degrees and other courses are provided online, and it does seem that Future Learn does seem to be playing an important role in supporting diverse and flexible lifelong learning in the UK, because this can be a mechanism for moving across institutional boundaries. But coming back now to the next slide, which you've got here, what are the destinations of the learning pathways? Does the student even know? Is the student well informed? Who informed the student? Where did they get the information from? If halfway along your pathway you want to change direction, is that allowed? How do you do it? And in fact, does the university know your planned destination and where you're going? Will the pathway require you to cross boundaries, different academic disciplines, different institutions, different countries even? And when we start looking at the destinations, are we just talking about jobs and employment? In the UK policy context, higher education is almost totally focused on preparation for employment. But there can be questions about what if the student gets lost on the pathway. Those, I think, are some of the questions about destinations. Where are you going? And in fact, they raise a lot of issues about information. Where can you get the information? And can you believe it? What do you do with it? Pathways are intended and unintended, and these raise policy issues. So if we could have the next slide, please. And there are questions about where does responsibility for quality lie when institutional boundaries are being crossed by students? Who awards the qualification if the studies for it have taken place in different universities or even other organizations? And indeed, Michaela mentioned the recognition of knowledge acquired in the workplace, for example. So questions about responsibilities of national and institutional quality assurance. I got quite a bit of help from the National Quality Assurance Agency in the UK, who were very clear that it was institutions that were responsible for quality assurance when it came down to flexible pathways. But then other quality questions are students sufficiently well informed to construct their own degrees? And let me give you one case study example from the UK, which was Birmingham University. Birmingham University provides what it calls a LANS degree. LANS is liberal arts and natural sciences, which in principle enables students to pretty much combine anything with anything. However, the university makes a lot of effort to assist students in selecting their pathways through the LANS degree. All students are assigned personal advisors, and plenty of information sources are available to enable them to make informed decisions about what to study, when to study, and even where to study. Because another feature of the LANS degree, it's actually a 4-year bachelor's degree where you have a year abroad at a university in another country. So national and institutional boundaries are being crossed, as well as subject boundaries in the LANS degree. So just coming back to the broader quality issues, other issues are teaching staff sufficiently well informed by what their students already know, because the students may have different, students they're teaching may have a range of different backgrounds. Is multidisciplinarity becoming the norm, that people cross the traditional subject boundaries? And also, how can students move between different institutions? That again is another issue in the UK system, where we actually found that there was very little movement between institutions. This was partly to do with the diversity. Different universities organized their courses with different curricula, so that if you had done year 1 at one university, it wasn't good preparation for year 2 at a different university. But also the competitiveness of the system. Universities didn't want to lose their students who were bringing them in money to go off to a different institution. So on the whole, there is still relatively little border crossing of institutions in the learning pathways across the UK. Next slide, please. I think still on quality, really. Issues for students who are traveling on their different pathways. Where have they come from and where are they going? These are issues that academics need to know if they are going to be providing the content for the pathways that the students need. And again, there is complexity there, because different students may have different needs at different stages of their pathways. So there needs to be a flexibility in what is offered. even in the, you know, the individual lecture, let alone on the across the system. Student learning, I like to make the distinction between our traditions of higher education, where students would learn a lot about a little, the little being a single academic discipline that you learn a lot about, where we're now moving on to the multidisciplinary option, where you can learn a little about a lot. And the lands degree, you know, was possibly quite a good example about that. So what this comes down to, I think, is important decisions for students to make about what to learn, when to learn, where to learn, how to learn. And then the big question is, are these well-informed decisions? Where do they get the help and support from to move along their flexible pathway? So next slide, please. As well as quality, we have issues of equality, or for that matter, inequality. Does our higher education system provide different pathways for different students? And we can relate to social class, to race, to gender, to age. We do have within the UK quite a stratified higher education system in terms of high reputation, low reputation, that links to a quite strongly stratified society. So there's some pathways for the rich and some pathways for the poor, and to some extent limited boundary crossing between the high and lower reputation institutions. So again, further questions about who travels on which pathways and to which destinations. And the points I've made about stratified higher education system and stratified society. Also, some students need to combine work with study. Is it because they need the money, or is it because they need the experience? Could I just mention as well here that I realize that most of my slides are posing you with a set of questions. That I think is not accidental, because I found that over the years with research that in many respects coming up with questions that you can't answer can be as important as the ones that you can answer. I remember doing a project once which was entitled "Things We Know and Don't Know About," that was about graduate employment. I think this is to some extent things we know and don't know about flexible learning pathways. And also it is a very much a fast developing area. So we're at an early stage, I think, of flexible learning pathways. One last slide. One of the other things we were finding, and this is particularly true of the pathways around the Future Learn program, is, are we still talking about higher education? Because we now in the UK hear policy references to post-18 education, adult learning, lifetime, post-school. Is this all part of higher education? Is it alongside higher education? Is it replacing higher education? I think these, or are they being combined? And this is further issues of flexibility moving across different sectors. So learners are crossing boundaries, not just within higher education. And indeed, what is quite interesting, I think, from the Future Learn work is that there are mechanisms there for learners to get recognition for learning that has taken place outside of higher education, but they can go into higher education to get a qualification for it. So plenty of happening. A lot of it is about training for jobs. And certainly a lot of the policy focus in the UK is about higher education as job training. But I think there are still questions about higher education being a social as well as an educational experience. And I think that is, again, something which the flexibility of the system raises questions. And going on from the job preparation for work, to what extent are our flexible learning pathways still promoting traditional concepts of critical thinking within higher education? And to quote from a different UNESCO event that I went to some time ago, is higher education still contributing to making a better world? At that point, I'll stop.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Michaela. We've got a lot of people lined up who would like to ask questions, and not much time. So what I'm going to do is ask you to be succinct in your responses to them. Ask our questioners to be succinct, and I'll take them in batches of 2 until we run out of time. So first we'll begin with Sharon and Ron. Sharon, can you come in, please? I know you're not on camera, but you can come onto audio.
Sure, thank you. From the US context, my question, I would like to hear elaboration on the funding slide, because what I hear a lot here is that credit is the driver for funding. And so collaborating across universities, et cetera, that presents a barrier. So I'd just like to hear some more elaboration on how you might address that issue. Thank you.
Okay, hold your response, colleagues. Ron Barnett. Ron.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for the talk and contributions we've had today. I've got a conceptual query, if I might. I'll start off with the question, is flexibility necessarily a good thing? I'll leave you to ponder that for 10 seconds, but I'll just expand that a fraction if I can, if Simon will allow me. I don't think we've heard anything in the huge array of things you have touched on, anything about the pedagogical relationship as such. And for me, there's a fundamental question here in a marketized higher education system. Are there or should there be any limits to the extent to which students should have control over either the pedagogy or the curriculum? And to me, this is a major issue facing marketized systems. In other words, could we envisage a situation in a genuine higher education system where students were given total control over the curriculum or the pedagogy? And if we want to say, no, there are limits, where are those limits to be?
No, good luck with answering in a succinct manner to those 2 questions, colleagues. Michaela or John?
Yeah, perhaps I take the first one and I leave the more difficult one to John. Yeah, on the credit-based funding. What we have seen, and I think it was confirmed also in the UK case study, is that when funding is provided on the number of students, higher education institutions have relatively little incentive to accept a student from another higher education institution who has already gained a certain number of credits, and to recognize let's say, the learning that has taken place in the earlier higher education institution. So that I think, John, you have emphasized that also in the UK case study acts as a disincentive. And what we have seen in Finland is that the Finnish Ministry of Higher Education, I think it is, actually provides a part of the funding on the basis of credits that students or that learners take on the open study route. So if there is a student who has not gained access to a study place but takes some credits, the university is funded for that. And if a higher let's say a returnee from the labor market comes back to higher education and takes a number of credits, the university is funded for this. I think that is really important to incentivize also, and to, yeah, in a way to fund these types of open access policies. Yeah, and John, the second question about is,
yeah, let me try and respond to Ron, which is a very important question. I mean, I would say, you know, that there is considerable diversity in our system. So I'm not saying that the answer I'm going to give you is one which would be system-wide, but it's the one which I found most interesting, really, which I remember in some interviews that I did. I think this was connected with Future Learn, where essentially universities were essentially shifting choice of modules, choice of courses to the students. But so in other words, there was a shift in where power was lying. The consumer could buy what they wanted to, but the university did put a lot of effort in trying to ensure that the students were making well-informed decisions. And so the student would be told, you know, that, okay, you can do this module, but on the basis of your previous experience, we think it is quite likely that you're going to fail this module. And so there was, I thought, this quite interesting mixing of, you know, the authority, but actually trying to ensure that students really understood, you know, what the issues were.
That won't exhaust your question, Ron, but it's a start. Can we bring in Fabrizio Trifiro at this point?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, John. Thank you, Michaela. I really enjoyed your contributions. I'm from IIEP, so the UK National Qualification Recognition Body. I wanted to ask you something in connection to what Michaela was saying about quality assurance, how quality assurance can provide the enabling framework for the development of flexible pathways, but could also hinder the development of flexible pathways. Did you find in your study, or did you touch upon in your study, on whether outcome-based approaches to quality assurance and recognition vis-a-vis, as opposed to income input-orientated approaches, could be facilitating could facilitate the development of flexible pathways, alternative routes to higher education and learning? Is that something you focus on?
Thanks, Fabrizio. Can we bring in Claire Callender for the second question?
Great. We've touched on the issue of funding and its centrality in terms of promoting flexible learning. My questions, one to John and one to Michaela, and that is, John, will the lifelong loans entitlement improve provision and the take-up of flexible learning in the UK, including credit transfer? And Michaela, what are the lessons for the lifelong learning loans that can be learnt from the funding of flexible learning in other countries that you've referred to?
mm-hmm.
Okay, folks, as you wish.
Okay, maybe I start with the first one. So, and a very, very interesting and very important question about outcome-based models of quality assurance. What we have seen in our case countries was that the combination of quality assurance, which is picking up on national qualification frameworks, on the level descriptors of national qualification frameworks, which induces this for program accreditation, was actually something which provided an interesting opening, I think, for flexible learning pathways, because it didn't look into curricula, it didn't look into content, but it looked really into outcomes, educational outcomes. So that was really something that was really interesting. But I think it's not quality assurance as such; it's really quality assurance at the program basis, which is and its linkage to the national qualifications framework, which proved to be really a strong enabling factor. The second, then perhaps I pick up from you, John, on the question on the lifelong learning entitlement.
Yes, let me do that. I mean, the first thing to say is that it has not arrived as yet, and so the details are still to be discovered, let alone the effects of it. But one point that I would make, and indeed this might point ahead to next week, because we'll be talking about micro-credentials in a week's time. But I think that as things stand at the moment with the plans for the lifelong learning entitlement, an awful lot of lifelong learning will not qualify. One of the things I was going we'll talk about next week, students who are studying micro-credentials in the UK typically already have degrees. And indeed, some of them, about a third of them, already have master's degrees. And as the lifelong loan entitlement at the moment is set out, they would not qualify for any further funding. So there is a somewhat contradictory aspect to the lifelong loan entitlement, that if you keep studying and gaining qualifications, and indeed this is another point about, do you want the knowledge or do you want the qualification? And in some respects, if it's just the knowledge or the skills that you want, it might be better not to gain the qualification, because then you will lose the entitlement to getting a loan anymore. So it's all difficult to say at the moment, and of course the issues of you know, you have to pay back the loan, you know, that although again, as we know, you don't necessarily have to pay back the loan if you can make sure you're poor enough, you don't have to pay it back. So I think, you know, very interesting questions, but I don't think we can really answer them yet.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps to add to this, I think from what I have seen internationally and also coming out of our project, this is the lifelong learning entitlement is really quite a revolutionary measure. So that goes quite far, I think, in the flexibilization of higher education. What we have seen in our project are, I think, maybe more timid approaches, like students being able to choose from the curricula of several universities, or credits gained via MOOCs, or learning, let's say, recognition of prior learning being recognized into traditional study programs, but not actually the full composition or the full spread of your higher education studies across your lifetime or your working time. So I think this is really something quite revolutionary. I think maybe the world will be watching the UK, how this is going to be implemented. It seems to be quite bold to me in many respects, but we will have to wait and see, I guess. Huh?
Thank you.
And thank you all. Our next questions, I think we've got time for one more batch at least, is first one's from Connor McKenzie, who's already on camera and waiting. Connor.
Hi, thanks, Simon, and thanks for the talks, everyone. My question's kind of similar to Claire's in some ways, but it's more about demand for flexible learning in relation to the lifelong loan entitlement. And I guess its first part is for Michaela. In other countries that you study, what kind of demand is there for programs such as that, or what that program is kind of aiming to unlock? Because I guess there's a question about scale, and whether it will be transformational on a kind of more systemic, on the system level. Obviously, you use the word revolutionary in terms of what it means for the individual, but are we kind of rewiring the system, and there's just going to be small changes in the outputs? And that links to, I guess, that thing about, the limits of flexibility that someone was asking earlier. This is being driven by, I guess, the idea of the customer. But interestingly, in some of the other examples you gave, that there's systems that aren't as marketized. So just whether you had any thoughts on that.
Mhm.
Second question will be from Sandra Binns. I see lots of thanks and congratulations for a good session flowing in the chat as we move towards the wind up. Sandra.
Hiya, yeah, thanks. So my question was not so much a question as a kind of comment about in the UK, most universities that charge the higher fees have to have what we call access and participation plans. So that kind of sets out how universities will encourage and access and participation from underrepresented groups. So some of the ones, John, you were talking about how our system is a bit stratified. And I think some of the regulation in the UK aims to kind of reduce that stratification. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on how the kind of flexible learning model, either that the UK is looking to implement or that other countries have implemented, have kind of reflected some of that, and if they've changed some of the access and participation agendas in those other models.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe I can start. I think we are coming a little bit close to the end. I think the question on the demand for flexible learning, I think that is a very interesting question, and I think it is very much linked to the student demography that we are having in different countries. So I think here in the global north, if I may speak like that a little bit broadly, we have a relatively stable and sometimes diminishing student demand in general for higher education. So I think here in the global north, we have much more openness for taking on board new student groups, people who are coming back to higher education, working adults who are coming back to higher education, who have very particular needs. And I think this is definitely one of the rationale to provide stronger openings for flexible learning pathways via micro-credentials and the like. In the global south, many higher education systems are still trying to respond to the traditional students who are coming there with a big push. So I think the reskilling and upskilling agenda is much less prominent there. So I think this question of demand for flexible learning pathways is very much linked to the student demographics that we are having in different countries. And so I just want to put this as, I think, a fundamental issue. Otherwise, I think we need to go much more into depth and into different country contexts. So John.
Yeah, very quickly, on the point about lifelong learning and the demand for continuing education, I would want to make the distinction between, does the learner want to acquire a qualification, or does the learner want to acquire knowledge and skills, or both, of course. But I think what quite a bit of the data does show is that when you get to the lifelong learning point, a lot of students are not bothered about getting more qualifications because they've already got qualifications. The Open University provides a lot of short courses which are free unless you want recognition and a qualification for those courses. And a high proportion of the students don't bother with the qualification, but they do take part because they want the knowledge or they want the skills. So I think that is an issue both for learners but also for the policymakers as well. On the other point about equity, I think we have huge tensions in the UK and in the higher education system here about approaching that. I mean, for example, you know, I can think of a university which I will not name, where I was, you know, being told, and although there will be a lot of support in the university for opening access more and allowing students from more disadvantaged backgrounds to enter the university. But there was worries about reputational damage if you actually did that. And there is somehow a notion that the best universities are the ones that it's most difficult to get into, and therefore opening things up, you know, more is perceived to be a disadvantage, and it's tensions, you know, between these different aspects, and we will see there is, you know, increasing talk about leveling up and making you know, quality. Yes, I mean, last thing I would actually say, I mean, I said this to somebody else recently, is that we have a lot of focus these days, you know, on increasing the opportunities for upward social mobility. I often feel that unless we actually provide opportunities for downward social mobility, which would make more room for the upward social mobility, that we're not really going to achieve all that much. But policies for downward social mobility, so for the you know, the rich who are quite stupid, that might be the next policy that we send down that we need to come up with.
Well, thanks very much, John and Michaela, and I trust that no one rich and stupid was tuning into our webinar today who would get offended by those last remarks. I was going to ask you, John, you know, if you had your druthers, what's the biggest barrier to flexibility in UK? You know, what's the thing you would dismantle or change if you were a minister for a year? But maybe we can save that question for another time. I mean, there's some fundamental issues that were touched on today, and you know, that issue about why flexibility was actually a very good issue to discuss, and you know, the question of agency, you know, whose agency it is, what's the role of systems and structures and academic faculty too in determining the character of the choices, and what's the role of students in determining the choices. I mean, they're not simple questions to answer, and they require, I think, quite a lot of thought. But thanks for a great project. I mean, you had tremendous attendance today. You had sustained a participant audience of over 80 people right through towards the end. Let me apologise to Ali Al-Rubian and Mary Catherine Lennon. I'm sorry we couldn't bring you in. It's the old logic of, you know, come in early to the Q&A and you get in on the call list. Next webinar, folks, is on Thursday, and it takes us back to the war zone. We've had one webinar on Russia, higher education in Russia. We've had one webinar on higher education in Ukraine, and now we've got part 2 on Russia, which is going to be about what's happened, and it's not a nice story, to higher education since the war began. And with us, we'll have two people who have got links into Russian universities, but are currently outside the country and able to speak freely. That's Igor Cherikov and Anna Splentsova. So we'll speak to them on Thursday. But meanwhile, we say thank you very, very much to Michaela Martin and John Brennan. We'd always like to have you both back. Very welcome to participate in our webinar program again in future. There's a lot of interest in the work that you've done here and all the other work that you do. Thanks very much. And to everyone, bye for now.